National Treasury is reportedly preparing a raft of cost-cutting measures as the coffers are beginning to run dry. We're running out of money. There's not much credit left. This includes getting departments and other sectors of government to try and reduce that spending. Let's try and get that right. And a moratorium to be placed on new hires and finding alternative sources to fund the ever-increasing wages. So let's try and get a sense then of how we're going to do this. Let's bring in Chris Hattingh from the Institute for Risk Analysis. Hello to you, Chris. Good to have you back with us. I know we're talking primarily economy this morning, but there's a risk factor involved, isn't it? Has South Africa hit its limit?
Good morning, Gareth. Thank you for the opportunity. Absolutely. The big risk here is for government, and it's in terms of its spending and its ability to fulfill its role or its ideal of being a quote-unquote developmental state, so providing services in healthcare, education, basic infrastructure, social grants, all those sorts of things. When your debt burden, as well as the interest on your debt, gets ever higher and higher, you then need to make some very pragmatic, difficult decisions in terms of your spending, and that in turn could mean a cut to services upon which so many South Africans depend in the current context of stage 6 load shedding, where some South Africans can afford solar panels, going off-grid, inverters, that kind of thing. Millions of South Africans simply can't afford that kind of thing. They can't afford those extra services. So now when you get cutbacks to state spending, possibly, then you're going to see the potential risk, even more so, of social unrest and frustration with the current status quo.
And anyone who's ever been in debt can understand how it can spin out of control as well. It's like a rock rolling down a hill. Let's just throw in some big numbers here, Chris, if we could for a second. And I say billions. It's as though it's like a box of Smarties. We just throw it around as though it means nothing. But here we are. So the budget deficit, 143.8 billion for July. Now, that's the largest budget deficit, if I'm not mistaken, for nearly 19 years. It must be in the early 2000s when we had the numbers lower of the 100 billions, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And tax revenue for the medium-term budget, so in October when we get that from Minister Godongwana, that will be around 82 billion rand lower, that tax revenue take, than was forecast in the February budget. So government having to do radical moves now to try and figure out where some of the funding will come from. You've got the tax base under a lot of pressure, but also you've got, in the context of an election, you've got promises around things like national health insurance, basic income grant, other forms of spending. Sort of where is the balance going to come, if there is going to be a balance? And also in the context of the rand weakening, government is finding more difficult to raise revenue in terms of selling government bonds, the rand not having as much value as it did before, again because of those domestic policy pressures like logistics issues, electricity, crime, the rule of law. That in turn means government can't raise as much as it would have done before, which puts yet more pressure on it to make very difficult, pragmatic decisions.
And we all know that Chris Hattingh always has his crystal ball with him. Hopefully you could charge it up when you had some power, Chris. I know we're in stage 6 blackouts now. So the forecasting of this is terrifying. I'll tell you why. 2006, 500 billion, let me correct that, 500 billion rand was our debt situation back in 2006, over 4.7 trillion in 2022, and that's only going to get worse, isn't it?
Yes, it most assuredly will, given the current trajectory. So to give Treasury and the Finance Minister credit, the right notes have been struck over the last 2 to 3 years, but you've still had public sector wage increases across the board, and you could argue that service delivery hasn't been matched by those increases. So now, where do you start to make those potential cuts? When you make those pragmatic decisions, if you can't arrest that trajectory, the debt burden just becomes higher and higher, and we pass that on to future generations. We can't just print money. We can't just print ourselves out of this problem. When you've got economic constraints and you've got less money, when you've got more money chasing less goods in the economy, you then effectively begin to erode the value of your rands, of your units of currency. That in turn means the potential for inflation or hyperinflation to take off. And that will likely be the worst case scenario for South Africans, especially poor to middle income South Africans whose money is not going as far already as it used to before. So we saddle them and future generations with that burden if we can't get a real cap on spending. There is some low-hanging fruit. You could look at cabinet spending, you could look at VIP services, you could also look at the public sector wage bill, and especially the state-owned entities. There are opportunities to get a handle on ineffective and wasteful spending and expenditure, but whether those decisions are going to be made in the context of the elections next year is another question in and of itself.
Yeah, I think you took the words out of my mouth. I was about to ask you that the odds of that happening ahead of going out to vote next year is going to be very difficult, because money, as we always know, Chris, very powerful when it comes to the political rhetoric in the build-up to elections. Just as I say goodbye to you briefly then, so solutions, if that's the word we can use, possibly coming into play by about mid-September. What do you think could be the biggest one we could expect? What do you imagine would have the biggest impact?
At the very least, if we could get some of those reforms around electricity and logistics going, because then we could unlock more growth. And that in turn will mean more tax revenue for the government, more economic activity going. The value of the rand would strengthen and increase over the short to medium term. If you can get some of those local domestic policy issues right, you in turn put yourself in a more resilient position fiscally going forward. With our logistics, if we can get more of our commodities out, that of course also means more revenue for the government and more economic activity, job creation and capital investment in general. In terms of other possible solutions, there has to be a hard line taken around the public sector wage bill, around the state-owned entities especially like South African Airways, which for the first 3 months of this year made a loss of 150 million rand for this fiscal year so far, 2023, 2024. You have to look at some of those state-owned entities, Transnet, Eskom. Those aren't going to be let go overnight, but with some of the others like SAA, you have to make these difficult decisions now to put yourself in a stronger position going forward. At the end of the day, we want to protect the value of the rand. We want to protect South Africa as a haven and a venue for capital investment. Globally, you don't encourage that sort of thing if you don't ensure that your domestic policy is on the right track.
Yeah, that's the risk behind us, which is why we talk to you. So Chris Hattingh from the Centre for Risk Analysis with his Economist hat on this morning. Lots of numbers, lots of risk, lots of concerns. Something has to be done.